Dobrý den, já děkuji za slovo a děkuji za pozvánku.
Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me the floor and for having been invited for this conference. I'm really glad that I can address you here today. I like to talk about a minor aspect of whistleblowing, and I would like to address also how it relates to human rights. I will be very brief. I have 20 minutes, and I would like to ask a few questions. At the very beginning, I would like to tell you about a few of my conceptual thoughts from a viewpoint of a professor of law, and Mr. Moravec remarked very well that this mainly is a question of labor law, and but I would like to show that also it is a question of civil law and human rights. So that's another dimension of whistleblowing that I would like to mention, that I would like to give you a few examples of documents that look at it from this perspective, namely the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10, mentioning the right to freedom of speech. And we need to understand that the European Convention is a tool that is actively used by the European Court of Human Rights, so it is necessary to look at it and to look at the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. And to conclude, I would like to present a few opinions. Some of them may be skeptical about broader application of the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, because I think that the model that it comes with as a means of protection of whistleblowers is very vague. So it doesn't really offer clear guidelines for legislating in individual states. I operate with the idea that we have a public space and a private space, or a secret space for secret and confidentiality on one side, and on the other a public space where information moves freely and we have free access to information. Looking into EU legislation, there is a very comprehensive provision for confidentiality of information, be it professional secret, banking secret, trade secret, medical confidentiality, protection of private data, already mentioned here today, protection of privacy in its broadest sense. So in our national law, we definitely have provisions for the question of privacy, secrecy, and confidentiality. On the other hand, we have a public interest in mind. There is also a provision, but it is much less practical, it is much more complex, and therefore more difficult to implement. Fight against corruption is provided for in criminal code, for example, but it is not as comprehensive as provisions for secrecy or confidentiality. Freedom of the media, that's another provision that gives opportunities to the public to get information, and that is again enshrined in, for example, the Convention on Human Rights. So looking at how comprehensive and complex the different provision on these two different things are, we can draw a conclusion that the private space, that the safety of the private space, the confidentiality has very complex provision and comprehensive ones, but legislation for freedom of expression is much less well legislated, much vaguer. And what I want to show is that it is very important to have legislation for this, and that it is very closely related to human rights. And on the international level, we can mainly quote the urges and resolutions of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe that look at protection of whistleblowing. It is clear that when talking about protection at workplace, protection against persecution, protection of witnesses, all this pertains very closely to human rights. So at first sight, despite there are no details, but the formulation itself shows clearly that this is a problem of human rights. Whistleblower Protection Act in the United States, if we very briefly look at its formulations, it says that the act aims to protect individual rights. So whistleblowing and protection of individual rights are in the forefront of the whole concept of the legislation. Today, also the British legislation have been mentioned mostly negatively. It does include the word protection of individuals. So you can see that some of the national legislation do look at it in this way. And last but not least, the European Convention on Human Rights, which originally does not deal with whistleblower protection. It's Article 10. I'm sorry, there is a typo here. And of course, whistleblowing is not only about freedom of speech, but also about individual conscience, which is Article 9, that has been wrongly mentioned here. So let's talk purely about Article number 10, about the right to freedom of speech. Just to briefly quote, it says that everybody has a freedom to hold opinions, to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authorities. And the Article 10 says not only this, but also exceptions to the freedom of speech. It lists exceptions to infringe on this law. In paragraph 2, it says that it carries with it also duties and responsibilities, freedom of speech. And here we can again apply the opinions of the European Court for Human Rights, which says that if we want to have exceptions to the fundamental rights, it needs to be legal, legitimate, and proportional. And of course, that's a question of how we understand what proportional is, what legitimacy is. And there are specific examples about for legitimate reasons. For example, national security, territorial integrity, public safety, prevention of disorder and crime, protection of health and morals, protection of reputation, that has already mentioned, because there are two parts to every whistleblowing case. There is always an employee and an employer. And to be brief, I would like to get to the actual case law of the European Court of Human Rights that tries to apply Article 10 to various situations, including cases of whistleblowing. The leading case is from Moldova. It's probably not as widely known as if it had been from Germany, for example. Usually the Hainish case is better known, but the Moldovan one is very important, but the verdict overlaps with the Hainish case. So what was it about? Guia versus Moldova. The subject of the report was an attempt of politicians to influence and interfere with the prosecutor office, and Mr. Guya, who reported it, was persecuted, and the court sided with the office of the general prosecutor, and therefore he appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, and they were probably very thankful that for the first time they could look into a whistleblowing case, and it was a case that was at the court dealt with the Grand Court of the European Court of Human Rights, so they had a possibility to set a case law. And the case law talks about 6 different criteria. The verdict was that if we apply Article 10 of the European Convention of Human Rights, apply it to whistleblowers, there need to be 6 specific criteria. The first one is that internal reporting mechanisms have precedence over external. So first you need to exhaust the internal measures and then turn to external. The second criteria is public interest. The third one is authenticity and substantiation of information. Another one is that there is actual damage caused. We need to look into motivation of the whistleblower. And the sixth one is a character of the sanction that was incurred. So this was the verdict in the Guya case. In the Heinisch case, this model was applied. In the subsequent cases it was not applied, and we could speculate why. There was a grand gesture by the court formulating these criteria, but later did not apply them because probably the court itself experienced problems applying this to each and every individual case. There were different cases, some were from the public sector, some were from the private sector. Maybe that the circumstances of the cases, given different sectors, give different occupations, so there were differences. In my opinion, the attitude of the court is not in itself wrong. All the criteria that are in the model in itself is very reasonable and acceptable. Of course, public interest needs to be there, motivation, damages, sanctions. It is a very logical system used here by the Court of Human Rights. But the question is whether such a rigid model can really reflect all the relevant consequences of a particular case. And probably the court itself came to the conclusion that it is difficult, sometimes more, sometimes less, to apply this model to individual cases. Sometimes they do not even mention whistleblowing explicitly. They do not refer back to the Guya case. So sometimes they do use different terminology. For example, the state who is being sued uses whistleblowing, but the court does not use this terminology, so they themselves probably have problems applying the model to all the cases. There are huge differences apparently between individual whistleblowers, and despite all these criteria being in itself very reasonable, but you need to balance them. They talk about ad hoc balancing. You need to choose priorities in each particular case. In some cases, some of the criteria will be more difficult, some will be less difficult. So probably that's the problem that the court faces now. So we can come up with 6 beautiful criteria, not only in case law but also in legislation, but later we can find out that the cases are so different from one another that you can't simply universally apply the model as a whole, but you only work with the individual criteria. It's up to the courts to try to apply the individual criteria and not the model as such. So that is something that the case law of the European Court of Human Rights case tells us. And of course the model itself also, there are discrepancies, and it sometimes it contradicts, some of the criteria contradicts one another. For example, there are some damages caused. Let's say we have a whistleblower who acts in public interest, whose motivation is honest. So why should there be a sanction, or what's about the proportionality of sanction? Should there be a sanction? Can there be a sanction? When are there sanctions? And when it is proportionate? So there are inner contradictions. Another point that can be problematic, I have 5 minutes left, but I will make it. Another problematic criteria is motivation. Let's say that the motivation is not pure, that there are some personal conflicts at the workplace, we all know it. But if it's really in the public interest, should a person be sanctioned for having not entirely pure motivations? Is in such a case this criterion relevant? For example, in the Heinrich case, the European Court of Human Rights faced a problem that the local administration agreed that there were some wrongdoings, but the general prosecutor said that it did not amount to a criminal offense. And probably it was not, but the whistleblower needs to decide this before they report. So how can we reflect what the courts eventually said about the case? And sometimes it's best just not to mention the motivation at all because it is vague, but it is mentioned in the case law. But how should we treat this aspect? Another thing pertaining to the case law of the European Court of Human Rights is the hierarchy of different occupations. The case law shows that they are very sensitive to judges who report wrongdoings, and they tend to set up more strict criteria or rules for security forces in general, be it the police, the army, be it doctors. So if a doctor reports on a colleague and therefore damages his or her reputation, can we apply the same conditions? For example, teachers, that's my case. If somebody questioned my reputation and damaged the trust of my students towards me, and should I be protected less than if it was a doctor or a different employee of the same institution? So are there different categories of occupation? Are there different categories of public interest? So if you report corruption, should you enjoy better or higher protection than if you only report risk to the environment? Should we make a difference? And what the difference would then be? And my final remarks, I think that the European Court of Human Rights provided a not very clear case law, which clearly shows the problems that legislators and legislation faces. It is a question of proportionality. We need to balance different ideals or values, principles. And when legislating, it will be a political decision. So we do have some principles, but there are limited. Something that really needs to be adhered to, such as personal data protection. But again, we can ask to what extent we can infringe on private data protection. So it really is a very comprehensive system. So my last point, my conclusion, it may sound paradoxical, but The case law of the European Court of Human Rights, it's not really clear, but still I would rather rely on the application, the actual application by the court, than on the legislators. Because it will always be a question of application, and it will always be a little unclear, a little vague, a little uncertain. However, this is a part of whistleblowers' reality. It will always be a little uncertain. And here I had this typo, Article 9 instead of Article 10, but Article 9 speaks about personal conscience, and whistleblower need to consult their conscience, and they act on their conscience. They do it to act on it rather than seek personal gain. And if we get rid of the uncertainty from the whistleblowing, it could be counterproductive. A whistleblower is and always will be a kind of hero because he acts on his conscience despite not knowing how it will turn out.